Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts, Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
Welcome back, folks, to Beyond the Crime podcast, the podcast where we examine forensic issues and topics and, I guess, discuss the application of schematherapy to some of these topics. Today, I'm very lucky to have with me Dr. Nathan Brooks, who is here to talk to us today a little bit about lone actor violence. I mean, it's really quite a buzz to have you on the podcast, Nathan, because Nathan, we go back sort of some way away. I think I provided some supervision for you when you were going through your training, your final training years at Bond University. And that's, I guess, how we met, wasn't it, through that process? And then you sort of worked at the clinic for a little while as well. So it's really great to be able to see you, see your career flourishing, and obviously doing this important work now in New Zealand, working for the police there.
Yes, it's wonderful, Lars, to be able to be on the podcast and join you. And yes, I certainly have to thank you for your supervision and guidance over the years, and it gave me a very strong platform, particularly with some of the cases that I got exposure to while working at the Forensic Psychology Centre back in the day. And it probably gave me a bit of a template for some more extreme forms of offending that I've come across over the recent years.
Oh, well, yeah, I know. It certainly can be a bit of an eye-opener, I think, with some of the cases we had back then. You know, it might be useful for our listeners, Nathan, if you can tell us a little bit about your background. I guess, obviously, I've shared a little bit about how we know each other, but a little bit about your background and I guess what led you to focus on lone actor violence and how you sort of got there.
Yeah, so I'm a forensic psychologist, and I've been doing it for, feels like nearly close to sort of 14 or so years now. And I started out in my early career being very interested in psychopathic folks. And part of that is I've always been interested in the extremes. So understanding the folks and the people and the offending that's just hard to understand. The ones that get us scratching our heads, that are curious, that defy the norms, that do everything that we probably don't expect them to do, and often can catch us out as well. So for quite a while, I looked at psychopathy, and my PhD was focused around that. And then in around about 2017, 2018, I noticed that there was a shift in the landscape that seemed to be happening. And for a long time, I think across the forensic psychology field, we were really focused on homicide and also sexual offending. But then we started to see this range of, I guess, mass casualty events is the best way to describe it. And it shifted. We saw new roles in the police, new trainings and scopes of practice emerging for psychology, and of course a whole different field of academia and research has started to emerge since then, and that's resulted in this idea or this term of lone actor being coined and developed. And in some ways, I think of lone actor as a term a bit like serial killer. So it's a really broad term that describes a particular type of offender, but within that term, there's a lot of variance. And, you know, we're starting to see a lot more of these acts and learn more about these folks.
Wow. So, I mean, the term is, and let me get this right, lone actor grievance-fueled violence, LAGFV. That's the acronym for this area, right?
Yeah, so look, I'd say a lone actor, if we want to break it down, a lone actor really is someone that wants to carry out a mass casualty attack, and they're doing this on their own initiative rather than at the direction of others, such as a group, such as what we might have seen in group-based terrorism. Now, like with a lot of things, the academics kind of got hold of it, and this lone actor grievance-fueled violence, or LAGFV, which is not easy to pronounce. Is this
It's,
more?
it is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I had to Lagvi, but I suppose it doesn't quite work that way. But yeah.
Yeah, so it's this more technical academic lean on lone actor violence. And
Mm.
essentially, there's a lot of debate and noise about what causes lone actor attacks. And we've seen it lumped under the terrorism area, ideologies, various social and political factors. So lone actor grievance fueled violence is essentially this broad term to say that when we cut down to the core, rather than sort of getting stuck in some of these other aspects, it's often the overarching driver is a grievance in some form or capacity.
Okay, so you're saying that this field really started to take hold in 2017, 2018. Was that? I'm just trying to remember back. I mean, in recent memory, there's been a few. I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about some case studies, perhaps a little bit further on in our conversation today. But I'm just trying to remember. Was there a number of incidences that particularly kind of brought this into focus for academics and for policing services? I mean, there was a guy in Norway as well, wasn't there? But I think that was in 2012, was it? Or
Yeah, that's
thereabouts?
Anders Breivik in Norway in
Yeah.
2011. There's been just a series of events that have probably had ripple effects across the globe. And yeah, arguably Breivik was probably one of the first, if not the most sort of significant lone actor attack. And then it's just rolled on from there. In Australia,
Mm.
we had the Sydney Link Cafe siege with
Yes, of
and
course.
Monis, and there was significant implications and changes that came out of that. New Zealand, the Christchurch terrorist attack in
Yeah.
2019. So, and then you sort of spread more globally across the international domains, and there's been lots in the UK and in Canada, and I think it's just all coincided with various funding as well, and
Okay.
various analysis and research, and that sort of led to things being refined.
Is it a phenomena that is occurring at a greater frequency than it has previously, as far as we understand it?
The short answer is yes. The trouble is the US, of course, accounts for a large percentage of just how
Right.
much that is occurring. So if school shooters would fit
Yeah.
under this term of lone actor, and the rates of that just continue to rise, or at least to continue to stay very constant and stable. So we're not getting a decrease in that. In terms of terrorism, that's probably plateaued out a little bit. But, again, like I come back to Australia, and between, I think it was it either around April or May? So from about a 7 or 8 week period, there were 3 attacks carried out this year, and then a fourth one. The offender wrote a 207-page manifesto, kitted himself up in a stab vest and GoPro military helmet, and then had a couple of butcher knives, and then went into a parliamentary office. But fortunately, didn't go through with the offending, and that only occurred recently in July. So we've seen
That was in Australia.
that was in Australia down in
Wow.
and of course we had the mass stabbing at Bondi. Then shortly after that, there was the stabbing of the priest by a young
Yeah.
adolescent, and then roughly about 10 days after that, there was another sort of, I guess, Islamic inspired attack in a car park in Bunnings in Western Australia, where I think he was a 15-year-old that was shot by police and killed.
Right. Okay. So, am I right in thinking that they're defining lone actor grievance fueled violence separately from terrorism? Is there or are they the same thing? Are they interchangeable terms?
Yeah, it depends who you ask, and
Okay. Okay.
certain academics would probably be horrified at linking that together. My personal view is they fit well under the term of lone actor, and a bit like what I was saying before with serial killer, with the term serial killer, we have variants within that terminology, or various methods, motivations that differ. And so when we think about lone actors, we have some that, of course, are intending to carry out terrorism, and they fit under that bracket. And terrorism, interestingly, probably is more at a criminal prosecution level, where we often see whether something fits or doesn't fit under terrorism. And then as well, ideology-inspired violence, which also fits under the lone actor side of things. And that, can be things such as right-wing, left-wing beliefs, various ideologies, incel types of attitudes and values. And then, of course, we have the various personal factors and social factors that motivate people. So there's a lot of variance just within that, but I think lone actor really nicely captures the cohort. And then if we want to look at it from an academic lean, we use the LAGFV acronym to talk about it more formally.
Impossibly long acronym. Yeah. Look, that probably brings us to my next question. Can you talk us through how grievance and fixation interplay in the minds of these individuals who commit these kinds of acts? Because, I mean, obviously that seems to be the core element of what might be driving this kind of behavior.
Yeah, the fixation aspect is interesting because there's, grievances and fixations are closely aligned. And there's some argument that lone actor grievance-fueled violence should have been called lone actor grievance and fixation-fueled violence. But essentially, the LAGFV kind of encompasses that fixation aspect. So, when we think about a grievance, there's always, or most typically, is an element of fixation and preoccupation that's associated with that. So that captures that. And, we do, of course, have some folks that fall solely more so into the fixation basket. And we're essentially saying that, they've become preoccupied and consumed by an issue or a person. And then they spend most of their waking lives thinking about it, gathering information. And, the classic example probably of a fixation-based perpetrator would be John Hinckley Jr., who became fixated on Jodie Foster, and after watching the Taxi Driver movie, and then to prove his love and with a grand gesture shot President Ronald Reagan at the time.
Wow. Yeah.
So we do sometimes get some variations.
That was to prove his love for Jodie Foster. Is that right? Like that was that was a driven way.
That fixation that he had on her, and really stalking her at the time and harassing her, and that sort of emerged as an ultimate last resort act.
I find that really kind of interesting. Like, I mean, my mind, I immediately go to, well, is he psychotic? Is he mentally ill? Is this sort of a symptom of that? But you're saying that mental illness, in the way that we understand it, with someone experiencing a delusion or hallucinations, or feeling they are under control by some power or something like that. I mean, I guess I'm asking, does that play a factor for these guys? Are they more likely to have these kinds of problems, have mental illness?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and there's a lot of variance and differences in sort of the answer around that. The fixated folks, where we primarily see exclusively fixation, there's a strong overlap with those sort of schizophrenia, delusional-based disorders, the psychosis. When we step back and there's more of a grievance lens, maybe coupled with a bit of fixation, then we see a range of different mental illnesses, and probably some of the more common ones are things around like autism spectrum disorder. We do also see personality disorders, features of, like with a lot of offending, entitlement, grandiosity, that really self-absorbed tendency.
Are there key psychological factors that you've identified that contribute to the motivation? I mean, now that we're talking about like I guess diagnoses, common diagnoses, I guess, and mental health type problems and personality problems. I mean, in this space, in this research, like, are there factors that are perhaps more likely to contribute to the motivations for someone that would do this kind of thing?
It is a difficult one to answer. So I think we get mental illness in the pure sense, where it's diagnosable and it's an obvious condition.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of subclinical stuff that's going on. Shame, envy, hatred of others, hatred of oneself, suicidality, despair, hopelessness. So those factors also play a big role. One of the ways I've recently been working on a paper with a colleague, a young fellow over in your homeland, Lars, from Copenhagen. And
Wonderful.
and we've been exploring the role of psychological needs as potentially drivers for this form of violence. And what we were proposing was that, we've got universal psychological needs that, we all strive to meet. And arguably, there's sort of 6 needs that we think are pretty key around belonging, sense of significance, having certainty in your life, level of autonomy and freedom, being able to foster a sense of identity, and ultimately, as we see by dating apps and people's behaviour, the desire for love. That I think love undisputably probably is a core need that we all seek out. And when we think about these and what happens when people don't achieve them, we can start to form a bit of an explanation for why some of this violence starts to come about for some of these fellows. So essentially we're saying that, when there's a thwarting or threatening to someone's psychological needs, then maladaptive responses can emerge. And I'll just step back though for a minute, and this is where the grievance aspect comes in, is, what we're saying is that someone suffers from some form of subjective experience, and ultimately it's their perception of that experience that's really significant. And that could be a humiliation, an injustice, being ostracized, harassed, a myriad of things. And then the implications of that are that it has some level of threat, or in some way it challenges something about them, whether that's their identity, their well-being. And that's where we start to tie that into their psychological needs. And essentially, when that stays unresolved and then they don't have the resilience or the strategies to address that, eventually they head down this path and cycle where then violence becomes a potential solution to that. And then that can be coupled with discovering ideologies and other aspects which can then accelerate that person towards violence.
It's I'm just thinking obviously about, obviously this podcast, we talk a lot about schema therapy as a therapy that we use with clients that we work with for these kinds of problems. And I'm reflecting, just as you're talking about this, the psychological needs, which are very similar by the sounds of it to the psychological needs that we talk about in schema therapy, but also that when those needs aren't being met, then there's a response, there's a reaction. And it seems like, within schema therapy language, we would say that reaction is around trying to sort of soothe or calm that distress that they feel in response to that need not being met. And violence, certainly in my experience, and perhaps also in yours, working with guys in who have histories of violence, who are prone to violence, I certainly see it a lot in my work with them, where they will ruminate on violence as a way of helping them regulate their feeling of perhaps being disrespected or humiliated or abused or hurt. And I'm just sorry for going off on a tangent, but it's maybe not a tangent. I mean, when I was working in the maximum security, one of the things that I would always ask guys about: do you have violent fantasies? Do you have thoughts, or you go over in your mind about violence? And a lot of those, the guys that I would interview who have these histories of violence, would all report, yes, I do. And they would say, yes, it's in response to this person or that person, or that's how I cope with when I feel upset or pissed off or angry at someone. That sense of just almost kind of flipping into this ruminating about violence and sadistic thoughts a lot of the time, about as a way of trying to harm themselves and feel good. So it's interesting because that kind of, that kind of matches over here a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does. And, I think it's a really good point, and it's very true of this population as well, because we often see that there's nearly some sort of solace that they take in retreating inwards, and that might tie into some of their personal skills, the social elements that we'll probably touch on as well, where it becomes this form of fantasy and escapism because interpersonally they don't necessarily have the attributes and skills to communicate their emotions or to resolve it in a pro-social way, or even the resilience to handle challenges and setbacks. So it becomes this form of escapism and dysfunctional coping. The problem is, over time, it becomes more powerful, particularly when it's left without intervention. And yeah, the easiest way to describe it is the dials get dialed up and the thoughts become more intense, more intrusive. And then we find that they might, meet others, or they might access things online, or they might have ways to fuel those thoughts. And then it really accelerates from there. And before we know it, they've, become quite a few steps disconnected from what social supports they had.
Yeah.
And they're on that pathway to violence.
You mentioned the case study of John Hinckley earlier. Are there other case studies that you believe are really useful for our listeners to understand, or maybe we can talk a little bit about that to help understand the dynamics of lone act of violence that you can think of now?
Yeah, I mean, Anders Breivik, of course, as we touched on before, is quite a significant one. Elliot Rodger, who arguably inspired the incel movement, whether intentionally or not, but he's become heralded as the representative of that. I think the Christchurch terror attack has had big implications internationally, and in that it's inspired a lot of other actors. And then even James Holmes, who carried out the mass shooting in the cinema at the Dark Knight premiere in Colorado. I mean, they're all quite compelling and frightening and alarming cases. Probably for me, there's two sort of spectrums that really stand out with cases. And the first is the methodical and meticulously organised individual. And then at the other end...
Who would that be? Who out of those examples or case studies would reflect that?
Really,
Anders Breivik.
He was one, wasn't he? That is
most of them.
Anders Breivik, absolutely. He spent years dedicating his life, which is unfathomable in many ways, that someone could be so focused over so many years, dedicate their finances solely to the cause, and be very planned and targeted and incredibly secretive. And that sort of stands out as not as an isolated incident, but as sort of one end of that spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is we get folks that over several years, there's just a slow, gradual build-up of factors that tip them over. And I like a model which is called the bathtub model by Bose Gnor, and he talks about essentially
what the bathtub model.
The bathtub model. Essentially,
okay, it's a vivid. Okay, I'm getting the idea.
These taps or water facets that are just slowly dripping in factors into the bathtub, and eventually it just tips over. It might take 20 years, and a good example of that is Thomas Mayer over in the UK, who killed British MP Joe Cox in 2016. He's 52 years old, but he'd always had sort of that strong nationalist views and probably leaned more towards the right-wing fascination with sort of the Nazi paraphernalia, and it just simmered away for years. And then as...
It's like picking up these grievances, and it's just fueling it over time. Yeah.
Yeah, and then as Britain moved towards the Brexit and had some immigration issues, and Jo Cox had her stance on that, that just tipped him over, and he targeted her. Another example that jumps to mind as well is a Canadian one in 2020, a fellow called Gabriel Wortman. And I don't know if you've come across him, but just
No, I haven't heard that name yet.
frightening in terms of, this is a fellow that was just loaded with risk factors. He's a dentist, a high functioning individual, very financially well off, but he obviously had a terrible upbringing. But his long-term relationship is very violent towards his intimate partner, and he had a history of sort of intimidating and frequenting with sex workers, taking risks, getting himself in trouble, but never really in trouble at the same time. It always was just on the periphery, and he'd work his way out of it.
And he was a dentist as well. So he had this occupation of being this competent, capable, conscientious, because I suppose you'd have, as a dentist, dentists need to be pretty conscientious, don't they? I mean, they need to be conscientious to get there and smart. And then to be able to hold that, you have to be pretty good at doing that. So he's having this almost like this split life, this double life.
Double life, where he's in a relationship and he's off seeing sex workers and having people on the side. But at the same time, he's collecting firearms, most of them illegally, and he is fascinated by the police, and he's purchased replica police cars. And so I think it's the 19th anniversary of his relationship, he has a very minor argument with his partner, and that just tips him over the edge. And he drags her into this car, which he has restored as a functioning Royal Canadian Mounted Police car. It can't be.
Wow. So all right.
Yep. So basically a police buff that has restored this police car. He's got the uniform, and essentially it sort of just all spirals from there. His partner manages to escape the car and hide out in the bushes, but he then gets his weapons and goes on a shooting spree. So he kills people in the local neighbourhood that he knows. He then drives into another town, sleeps there overnight, and then continues the next day. And to the point, though, that when police were looking for him, they couldn't find him because he's driving around in a police car. And so at one point, they had sort of a blue-on-blue scenario, essentially, where they thought it was another police officer, but it was actually him heading towards them, and he killed a police officer, and then they pulled up next to him at a service station, and again couldn't tell it was him, and eventually they at another service station they got him and killed him.
Wow. And that's kind of fascinating, because it sounds like there was planning and perhaps intent happening sometime before this actually happened, right? I mean, if you kind of go to all that trouble, like there's some kind of premeditation in terms of this is where it's going eventually in his own head, perhaps.
Well, he's a really interesting one from that psychological needs point of view, and that was what we were exploring in the paper that we've recently written. And he's a guy that's loaded with risk. He's a ticking time bomb for something. And then,
so you mentioned, just for the benefit of viewers who might not be familiar with risk assessment, when you say he's loaded with risk factors, what do you mean? And explain a little bit more of
really based on, he's got a history of assaulting people, strangers, his partner. He's got a fascination with firearms. He's previously been brought before the Dental Association for things he's done to patients, and then he's an alcoholic, essentially,
right?
Enormous amount. So there's a lot there, and then we'd probably also argue about his personality structure. Might be a bit more leaning towards that sort of narcissistic presentation,
and perhaps even quite psychopathic as well, isn't it? There's that sort of double life that he's leading, like that we were sort of alluding to. I was just reflecting when you were describing how he committed his crimes, how he actually camouflaged himself by being a policeman, and was able to successfully kind of thwart attempts to try to stop him, because he was so good, perhaps, at being able to just, who's going to pull up a policeman, right? In this crisis, everyone's going to be relieved to see a guy driving around when they're chasing some mass murderer person in the street. So a brilliant disguise, but clever enough to kind of figure that out, plan it, set it up, and then once he starts doing it, he's able to sort of move around without being stopped or even identified for how long was it?
Well, it was only 2 days.
Right.
So, but the other aspect as well, I think there was, in terms of, he was loaded with risk, but how that was going to be carried out probably was a bigger question if he was to offend. One might have thought that he was going to kill his spouse more so than rather go on a killing spree. But interestingly, so April 2020, as we know, was the sort of peak or early stages of COVID, and his dental practices had to close.
Right.
So things started to change in his life. So he's always he was a fellow that had a lot of money. His identity was associated in his dental practice, and he's had a high degree of freedom. And then we've got restrictions that were placed on him. He couldn't move around as freely. He's not practicing in his dental practice, and he's spending a lot more time with his spouse than he normally did. And so there's some evidence to suggest as well that he had a bit of a decline in his mental health, and that he became a bit more paranoid, and also thought that COVID was a conspiracy, or that there was the government out to get them. So that probably also functioned as a tipping point, but he had a lot of capability enhancing factors that made him risky or dangerous.
Already, sort of like, so it was like he had these vulnerabilities, I guess we would call them, and then the stress of COVID and being isolated kind of amplified them. Like you mentioned before, turned the dials up to 10, if we can use that kind of metaphor. So that's kind of interesting, because you kind of highlighted a number of things there. You've highlighted, this idea of isolation is being relevant for some of these guys, a role for mental health, and also life stressors. I mean, are you able to talk a little bit more to those factors in terms of how those areas sort of play out in the lives of these lone actors? Or how does it influence perhaps their pathway to violence?
There's been some good research to suggest that in the 12 months leading up to attacks, that on average people are experiencing around 3 to 4 life stresses. So I think that's when we think about things from both a risk and prevention point of view, when we can see that there's things going on in the person's life and they're struggling to resolve them, and even going back to, how that impacts their livelihood, their identity, some of those psychological needs, and we can see that there's an obvious impact and maybe things are declining for them, then that can often be, a pretty good precursor to, agencies and various practitioners that are involved, that support becomes quite essential. And it's really when that is left unchecked, or the person rejects that support, or we can see that they're getting more heightened, or arguably even that they are just disengaging and becoming more reclusive, and potentially going online and using some of that material as a way to sort of support and fuel their beliefs, then we can get a bit of a toxic cycle going.
Online, I mean, obviously that's a bit of a thing at the moment. People's concerns around online influence. We've seen, I think in the last month, perhaps, lots of anxiety or concerns around, in the UK in particular, I'm thinking, where there's been claims that online influencers have really contributed to problems that have been happening there. Do you, what's your thoughts on this? Has the internet, do you think, does it contribute to the radicalization and the fixation of these guys? Is that a part of it? Is that a pattern to it? Do they have these vulnerabilities? Do they get life stresses? And then in the context of that, there's an influence from the online material that they read, or communities that they get involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. And undoubtedly, I think where we're at in society with this lone actor issue that we're seeing, the internet has a big role to play in that. It's a bit like fire. Fire can be helpful and provide us with warmth, but without the right parameters, it can be incredibly dangerous. And the internet is probably very much like that.
That's a very powerful metaphor. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen that heard that metaphor being used, but I can really kind of see it. And I certainly also can relate to. I certainly with some of the clients, we did an incel episode a few episodes ago. We talked about it very briefly before we came on here, and it seemed to me that this fellow that I had been referred to me had a significant driver to his to the violence, although he didn't end up committing it, to him becoming quite fixated on violence had been in the internet, being exposed to ideas and chat groups and people who sort of gloated over that kind of thing.
There's a lot of that going on. And the challenge is when that tips over to someone moving towards violence. I think there's a lot of people exposed to that, and that's shaping their views. There's often additional factors, as we said, life stresses, I guess mental illness or various sort of personality traits. And then, of course, we add grievances onto that as well. That can then
it's a toxic
tip someone over. So I think there's a large percentage of people that, are looking at various ideologies and those sorts of things on the internet, and they can do that, and it's not going to necessarily result in violence. But there's a small percentage where it becomes a really, I guess, a catalyst or an accelerating factor, another layer that just adds to, or another thing that tops up the bathtub. Yes, and it serves as fuel. And we're in a really strange place, I think, with society. Some ways, I think the mass casualties events that we're seeing has a little bit of a contagion-like effect. Now if you're upset and you're angry, you want to go out and kill lots of people. And it reminds me a bit of what we see with suicide. Suicide has a contagion effect as well. It's been, for many years, contained in the media. It's not reported because what happens when it is openly discussed and reported, it can lead to other people committing suicide. And we are seeing so much of this across the media, and there's no doubt that there's a copycat effect and also a contagion effect at play. And of course, the internet has changed social dynamics, and that has big implications as well.
Yeah, the contagion effect is a very interesting one. It's one that I find is compelling to as a psychologist, and when I think about some of the issues that we have in our communities these days, and in terms of these kinds of things, is just how this phenomena exists. Like, there's a phenomena known as contagion. There's emotional contagion. We see it with suicide, with this stuff. I mean, that makes complete sense for me as well. We also know that I think within the eating disorder literature, there is, you put individuals together with one or two having eating disorders, and suddenly all of them will get eating disorders. There's this kind of effect that happens within groups of people when they get close together, or they start talking or spending time together, or it can, so it's a fascinating thing. And I think it's one that an area that hasn't really, I think, been really discussed or considered, I think certainly within our mainstream media, very much at all. Anyway, wow. So that leads us, I guess, Nathan, what do you think? What are strategies? What can we do about this kind of thing? How do we identify and how do we prevent this kind of thing in the community? Like, what are people doing?
Well, it's a very complex question. And I'll try and...
We like the complex questions beyond the crime. That's what we get to.
I'll try and articulate it as well, because there's a lot of different components to that. So, look, a short version of it is, first we need to identify these folks. So we need the information to come in to get to the right people when there are concerns. And then they need to be linked in to support and various prevention options. So firstly, when we think about the police role in this, things have really changed in that landscape, and it's become much more therapeutic. It's about identifying concerns and putting prevention in place. And, across a lot of countries, we've seen threat teams that have come together, specialised threat units, fixated threat assessment centres, and they've incorporated psychologists often or various mental health professionals to get better at understanding people, understanding the issues, and then developing plans to address and support the person. So that's been a really positive shift. And of course, another part of that is we need really accurate assessments to know how concerned we need to be about someone. So we put the prevention and the support in place, but at the same time, we need to know when we need to move and when the concern is a really real concern, and that might then require a different type of response. So there's that aspect around putting in a more holistic and therapeutic response to just the identification and management stage. Then there's also the larger question, I think, which sits at the individual level and then the systems or societal level. So what do individuals need, and then what does society need to be doing? And what we probably find is the societal responses, government stuff, agencies, departments, even big tech companies, that doesn't always match what individuals need, and we can get a bit of a gap emerge there. We don't always get a nice feedback approach which funnels from society down to the individual, and then it's refined and adjusted. Unfortunately, sometimes we get policies and processes which are not necessarily beneficial. And then when we look at it at the individual and the ground level, where people are getting out there and trying to work with these folks, they don't necessarily have better support or better options to improve things at the individual level.
Can you give me some examples, or when you say that the policies and policies that might not work, that actually go against the intent of trying to create a safer community in relation to this particular issue?
Yeah, look, one of them which is a really contentious topic, is around the infringement of people's privacy. Okay. So greater restrictions on people's privacy, greater surveillance, those various aspects in order to prevent the next attack. And there's big question marks around, does that work? We look at something like the Black Swan effect, and there's a really interesting book that's written on that. I can't remember the fellow's name, but it talks about 9/11, and if we could have prevented 9/11, we would have prevented 9/11, and often we're responding and putting measures in place based on the last attack. But of course, people don't then replicate that. They develop a new methodology. So we're constantly chasing our tail. And you could probably also argue in some respects, like de-radicalisation programs emerged, and they were put together quite rapidly in some places and really varied in how they were rolled out. And initially it was heavily focused on sort of the Islamic offender, the jihadi-inspired violence, but this area has evolved so much that that's only a very small section now. So we saw so much funding go into de-radicalisation programs, and the jury's really out on how effective they are. So what we see is funding and rushed approaches, and that's not always actually what's needed. But it's the folks on the individual level and that are doing that frontline work that can give the really good feedback that can then result in that refinement and adjustment.
Yeah.
And
okay.
A couple of things we could probably talk about, that jump out, I think, at the individual level as being really interesting. I think first of all is, understanding that a lot of this violence is emerging as sort of a dysfunctional response to being able to deal with a threat or challenge within your life. So I think that's probably the first thing. Secondly, and this fits quite nicely with your schema program, is this idea, I think, of the hero's journey. And it's really fascinating as I've been looking over this issue and putting a book together on the topic. The hero's journey is quite fascinating. So for those that don't know it, so Joseph Campbell coined this term back in 1949, and the crux of it is basically that by pursuing the hero's journey, you gain greater meaning in life, and it really becomes sort of a pursuit and a positive thing for us to, and also a mitigator to challenges and issues when they arise. And when people don't satisfy that, when they're not able to be, I guess, their own hero or to see themselves in that light, then a whole range of dysfunctions can happen. And there's been some really interesting research about that in recent years, which could mount a good argument that not only could this be an effective treatment, but if we got this into schools and could teach people to change and shift their thinking and have a level of autonomy and believe that they're capable of writing their own story and scripting that out and seeing challenges as exactly what they are, challenges rather than
to be overcome,
rather than threats, then I think that can also be really powerful. And probably the last one would be going all the way back to what we know about sexual offending as well. And, Tony Ward's stuff around the good lives model, the ingredients to a good life, and what happens when people can't achieve those and then start finding maladaptive ways to meet those needs as well.
Wow. Nathan, I mean, this has just been a fascinating conversation with you, and and as you're talking about this, like it's interesting that what we can see at the very core of this issue is around this emotional needs that aren't being met for these individuals, and their attempts, ostensibly, what it seems to try to deal with or help themselves resolve that in some kind of way, and that it then kind of sort of flows over into this kind of into this behavior, this violence, right? So this is just a really interesting thing from a schema therapist, and we'll talk more about that in the next episode. But fascinating. So so this brings me to probably my last couple of questions here for you, Nathan. So we obviously have a number of psychologists and therapists and counselors that listen into the podcast, who will work with clients. Now my sense is, right, that folks who would fall under this category aren't necessarily going to be your traditional forensic client who's caught in the criminal justice system. Then they could very well be a person who hasn't or has got limited criminal history, who's just struggling in the community, and they have these cluster of risk characteristics and a fixation and a grievance issues. Is that right? So,
absolutely.
So you would conceivably think that individuals, who are seeing just when I say regular clinical psychologist or counselor or person, that there'd be someone that wouldn't necessarily present with lots of big red flags around them until you start to hear their story a little bit. Yeah. What advice or guidance could you offer that therapist professional working with someone that they start to think that they've been listening to this podcast, they've been listening to you, and they start to go, I'm a little bit concerned about this guy. I don't know what to do. Like, where do I go with this? What can you suggest?
Yeah, that's where I think we've seen a shift in the psychology practice in recent years. And traditionally, we've always thought about risk. And when we think about that scenario that you just highlighted, what we're really talking about is a shift and a potential escalation in level of concern. And that's what really the term threat is about. There's an emerging threat. So there's an enhanced intent, and that could coincide with an enhanced capability as well.
How would you measure that? So what would you...
Yeah, so Reid Malloy, who many folks will have heard of, has done some great work with this, and he's identified 8 warning behaviours.
Okay.
So we've got pathway, which is evidence that the person is engaging in some level of planning or preparation to carry out some form of violence.
Okay.
We've got fixation, and fixation is around a psychological preoccupation with an issue or cause or whatever it might be. So the cognitive dials are dialed up. Then we've
And this
got
is a grievance fiction. This is like a grievance fixation, right? It's yeah.
yeah, and fixation though might also grievance, but it might also then relate to an ideology aspect as well. And
Okay.
the leading course to that would be that violence is a means to progress that ideology. Then we've got identification, and that's really around that we see a shift in the person's identity. So sometimes if they become fixated enough, we see that they then start to identify, for example, with that cause. And one of the things about identity is often they take on this commando or warrior type identity. So
I've seen that. Like that's the thing, right? Like a lot of these guys will, or some of there seems to be a pattern that they get all kitted out in commando gear, or what's that computer, the PlayStation game where they have all the yeah, you know.
Yeah, and we and many of them wear similar outfits and similar sort of commando type material to carry out their attacks. So it becomes part of that sort of psyche as well. Also, some suggestion around novel aggression. So some of them may go out and commit some other sort of, I guess, confidence testing act to see whether they have the confidence or the bravado to go through with that. So it might be a sort of random act of violence or something that tests their willpower.
Right, so it's like testing themselves out, like whether they can resolve. Yeah, okay.
Alongside that, there's some information to suggest that some of them might have a shift in their routine. So it's called an energy burst. So they might become a bit more chaotic or a bit more manic, or stay up longer hours. There might be a sort of shift in their patterns of behavior as they're getting more towards carrying out violence. And part of that comes through this sort of anticipatory excitement of doing something.
Right. So like an energizing kind of effect, that's what we'd be looking for. Someone just suddenly becomes much more active, much more motivated, much more energized around some of this stuff.
Yeah. Then there's also leakage as well. So we have someone that communicates their intent to a third party. So they might make an offhanded remark about, you know what, next week I'm just thinking I'm going to go in there and shoot up that workplace. And
right.
And in so many of these cases, we find that at least in 50% of the cases, sometimes up to sort of 100% of the cases that have been sampled, there's evidence of leakage. So someone makes a comment.
70%. So in almost 7 to 8 occasions out of 10, people will flag it to other people in their remarks in some kind of way.
The stats say between 50 to 100% of the sampled studies. So essentially, friends, family, even sometimes online to others, they'll make these remarks, and there's evidence of that intent beforehand.
Wow. Okay. Fascinating.
And then I think I might be missing one more, but the last one I can recall off the top of my head is directly communicated threat. So that they've also made some other threat in the lead up to carrying out the violence as well.
Wow. Okay. So so these are the kinds of factors that we'd be looking at if you're sitting with someone in the community and you're just working with them in a therapeutic capacity, and you have these kinds of concerns. You would, so just let's list them out again. So it'd be a sense of fixation, a sense of grievance, maybe about a sense of grievance and fixation on a particular personal issue or topic, a change in their routine that is manifest in becoming more energized or more, alert, or just staying up all night, maybe. What are some of the other ones I'm missing?
Leaking. So
leaking.
talking about
starting to talk about it.
Yep.
being linked to some kind of ideology that kind of glorifies or sees violence as a solution, as a reasonable solution, as a justifiable solution,
A shift
and a
in
direct threat,
identity.
obviously.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm going to do this. You need to listen very carefully when someone says that.
And a shift in identity as well. So we see that they start to identify with being someone that's capable of carrying out violence, or
Yeah.
others that carry out violence.
Wow. Okay. Fascinating. Wonderful. Thank you, Nathan. I'm mindful that we're running out of time. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Are there any final thoughts that you, in your opinion, that you want to sort of tell our listeners about when you think about what are some of the most critical takeaways for the people that might be listening in terms of the psychological analysis of the lone actor violence?
Look, there's probably I think the best way to sum it all up is there's a really good book by Dan Heath, and it's called Upstream. So I would recommend that to people that are listening, and I'll just give a very quick story to finish things off, to probably highlight the point. But there's a group of friends that are out picnicking near a river. Now, their day is suddenly interrupted by the sounds of screams coming from the water nearby. And they can see a child has fallen into the water and is being swept up downstream. So together, the group of friends run down to the water and rescue the child and pull them out. They return to their picnic, but again, a few hours later, they hear screams and there's another child in the water. They run down, help the child out, and then just as they get back to their picnic again, the same thing happens, and it happens over and over again. Finally, one of the females in the group runs off and heads towards the river where there's a bridge. Now, frustrated, one of the other people in the party yells out at her, going, "Where are you going? We need you here to help." But she replies,
Pulling out the kids.
"Going to fix the hole in the bridge."
The hole in the bridge.
So the moral of the story is that we can't keep reacting, and we can't just, put barriers and restrictions in place. We've got to get to the cause, and measures to stop the issue will only contain the problem. So we've got to get to the cause. We've got to get to the beginning, and we need to put time and effort in. And like with a lot of issues, it starts with children. And in this analogy, we need to start fishing upstream. We need to provide the support early on so that children are moving in the right direction. They have the resources to them, and we're not just responding once the problem's occurred. And again, going back to the idea of the hero's journey, the ingredients of a good life, I think we need to start building some of that into, school curriculum, and getting these things in early, so people have their own psychological capacities to mitigate issues when they arise.
Wow. I love that analogy, Nathan. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast today. And I'm sure this is going to be a very popular and very well listened to and valued conversation for people out there. Now, I know that you're also doing some training, some online training. So folks, if you're interested in knowing more about this topic and knowing more about the work that Nathan does, he also has when is it, the training event that's happening online? So tell us a bit about the training that you're doing, Nathan.
Yeah, so it's a webinar on targeted violence. And a lot of what we're talking about today, if we take a step back, is targeted violence. And we just touched on those warning types of behaviors, and how do we get better at picking when someone is potentially becoming a concern and there is increasing intent and capability. And the training is really about improving our practices around that. And that's, I think, across multiple fields, whether it's, with psychology or even in the security space, we need to get better at making sure that we can catch things early. And the training's about that. And it's looking at strategies and approaches to, improve our practice.
Is there, and obviously we'll include the link in our podcast here. Is there, for the benefit of people listening or watching, where can they sign up?
So jump onto my website, which is just nathanbrooks.com.au, and people will find it under the events section on the webpage.
Wonderful. Excellent. All right, Nathan. Thank you very much for coming on Beyond a Crime, a psychological analysis. We'll, of course, be dissecting this topic in our next part with Rob Brockman and Shay Addison in terms of trying to talk a little bit more about these concepts and applying forensic schema therapy ideas, concepts, interventions to clients who may present in this way. Thank you once again, Nathan, for coming on board. It's been great to see you again. I'm always amazed at just how much you've traveled along the way. You started in Tasmania and the Gold Coast, then Brisbane, and then Townsville and New Zealand. So you're very well traveled. But it's really fascinating and wonderful to see your career developing as well as it is. So and it's great to have you on here as well, and to have that connection with you again.
Thank you, Lars. It's been wonderful to chat and talk about such a ongoing issue in our field.
Get hands-on experience with schema therapy at the Forensic Schema Sessions live training. Visit psychclinic.com.au/workshops for more information.